Please sit down. This is a festival day. It's a festival day that occupies a very prominent place in the Church's calendar. In the Book of Common Prayer order for the Holy Communion, there are only 5 occasions in the year which warrant the special provision of what is called a proper preface. Those days are Christmas Day, Easter Day, Whit Sunday, otherwise known as Pentecost, Trinity Sunday, and this day, Ascension Day. A holy day on which Christians were expected and are expected to make their communion. Ascension Day has an essential place in the Church's year, which is built, that year is built around the narrative of the Gospel of the evangelist Luke. It works through a cycle dramatizing the life of Christ every year, or rather in about half a year every year, beginning with the anticipation of his coming in Advent, followed by the season of his birth at Christmas, the childhood events such as the presentation in the temple and the circumcision, the 40 days of his temptation in the wilderness, dramatized for us by the season of Lent, that tumultuous week in Jerusalem with his execution and resurrection, the week we call Holy Week. And finally, the Ascension, that ascension of Christ into heaven, told twice by Luke, as we will have heard and will hear, told in the Gospel at its very end, and at the start of his account of the growth of the Christian community in the Acts of the Apostles. And all culminates, this whole narrative culminates in just 10 days of time in the coming of the Holy Spirit on the disciples on the day of Pentecost. That's, in sum, the whole narrative of Luke's Gospel. And it is the dramatic part of the Church's year. And it's so because the Church's year is built upon the other, Luke's account. So there's no doubt about either why this festival exists as the last public event in the story of Jesus on earth, and there's no doubt about its importance historically in the life of the Church, its prominence as a festival. But to be frank with you, that prominence does feel historic, not present. I reckon, and I have reckoned this for a great many years, that the Church is rather embarrassed by it. Here are just a couple of things that illustrate that embarrassment. It's an embarrassment which is not so prevalent in other occasions which I've named. I had been, before I came here, vicar for 10 years of a church that shared its life and its buildings with the local Methodist church. In fact, we merged in my time there into a single organisation. And part of that merger was our use, when I arrived, now 27 years ago, of the Methodist Church's hymn book, Hymns and Psalms. That was published in 1983, so very nearly 40 years ago. And in that book, rather oddly, it seemed to me, the hymns pertaining to the birth of Christ, to the resurrection of Christ, the resurrection of Christ and the ascension of Christ were bracketed together, as it were, jumbled up amongst one another. Those who compiled that book, who put it in order, did not see any distinction in the way that our church's year does between the resurrection of Christ and his ascension from earth. Another little example. I experienced it again this very morning, as did, I suspect, those who came also to morning prayer here in the Cathedral or in anywhere else in the Church of England that uses this book and the services within it. Daily prayer in the Church of England's common worship pattern. It's, I think, a really rather fine work, this book. It provides very easily, by comparison with many others, very easily followed services for worship, day by day, season by season. And we have just today come to the provision for Ascension Day. And we find there in 3 pages compressed, with all sorts of bits left out and references to passages earlier in the book, later in the book, an order of service, or an outline order of service, for both morning and evening prayer, which have different canticles and which provide you therefore different prefatory material for those canticles and so on. It's a jumble. It's very, very hard to use or make head or tail of where you're going in that book. And I'm glad every year when I don't have to conduct the service of morning prayer on Ascension Day. It quite evidently was conceived as an afterthought after the rest of the book had been constructed. I'd have to say those who compiled it were probably a bit baffled by Ascension Day. There are lots of other things in the church's year that may well embarrass us, and especially those who, like me, are of perhaps a rather sceptical cast of mind. For example, the virgin birth, or the bodily resurrection of Christ. I've known many Christians over the years who find these both very difficult intellectually. But having said that, generally speaking, we, the church, we Christians, seem able to swallow our embarrassment and to find ways heartily to celebrate the child in the manger, with all the accoutrements of the ox, the ass, the angels. And we happily mark the puzzling narratives of the resurrection with dawn celebrations on Easter Day, and with the representation of the empty tomb of Christ, which we have on the plinth down here by the altar. The church has not turned its attention away from these events in the life of Christ, which present comparable difficulties. And yet, here with the Ascension, we seem to have become embarrassed and to have sidelined it. And looming upon us and far more dramatic and perhaps comfortable to the current church, and looming very much larger in its imagination, is the coming feast of Pentecost. Well, here are two things we know and which relate to this day and to this festival. We know that now, in this era, in this realm, the man, Jesus, the subject of Luke's narrative, of each of the Gospels' narratives, the reason we are here worshipping him. We know the man, Jesus, is not to be met and touched as a man. He is not here. We know that. And we also know that we accept his lordship of earth and heaven, that he has that exalted position, a position over us, metaphorically, though parted from our sight. Now, the good news for me, and I think for all of us, is that we are just embarked upon a series of 5 evening meetings on Mondays, which focus on different major themes of theological import for us. And the third of those sessions, in a few days' time, will focus on the Ascension. And it's good news because we can come back on that occasion to tease out more and together its meanings and its problems. And it's good news for me because I don't now have the obligation of trying to solve all those myself right now. So instead of doing that, I'm going to leave you and leave myself too a number of questions. Well, first of all, I boldly asserted that the church is embarrassed about the ascension of Christ. Is it? Are you? Does the very notion of Christ's ascension tell of an impossible worldview? One in which a physical body lifts off into the heavens and reigns on physically high. Can this festival, on the sidelines, apparently kept residually out of habit, out of enjoyment of its lovely music, its special hymns, can this festival be reclaimed, reimagined, so as to speak boldly about the nature and the purpose of God in his Christ in this world? And how might we do that? The Ascension is not, in my view, an unnecessary embarrassment and appendage. It's an essential part of the story of the Christ. And that means we have to find ways that we can live it as an essential part of our faith in this place.